Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Natasha Harvey, and on behalf of Everbridge, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar entitled Communication Under Pressure, 8 Best Practices for Managing a Crisis. So before I introduce our speakers, I'll just explain how the webinar will operate today. All of you on the call are in listen-only mode. However, you can submit a question at any time during the webinar by typing in the open text field in the questions and panel section and send your question to all panelists. We'll review and collate the questions as we go along and aim to cover as many as we can in the Q&A session at the end. This webinar is being recorded. Links to the recording of the webinar and slides from today's presentation will be available within a few days of today's session and will be sent out to you. So now I'd like to introduce our presenters. Neil Laver is a director at Everbridge, a critical event management SaaS provider. He has a vast number of years' experience in UK, European and international markets. Ollie Tovey is a resilience officer at South Western Ambulance NHS Trust. The emergency and urgent care services cover a fifth of England and have more than 4,000 staff members. In today's presentation, Ollie will cover lessons from the M5 shooting and the NHS cyber attack. Following this, Neil will take us through the 8 best practices of communication under pressure. Then we will have a short Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, I'd now like to invite Ollie to start the presentation. Over to you, Ollie.
Thank you, Natasha. Good morning, everybody. As Natasha said, my name is Ollie Tovey. I'm a resilience officer within our Emergency Preparedness, Resilience and Response Department of the South Western Ambulance Service. My main responsibility for the Trust is trust-wide business continuity, and linked to that is resilient communications, of which Everbridge is one of our identified critical methods of communicating to our stakeholders. So the stats that you've got on your screen at the minute kind of say it all. We cover a fifth of England's mass. We provide the 999 emergency care to our residents, as well as our transitional visitors every year. We've got 4,000 clinical and operational staff crewing the frontline ambulance responses, our critical care helicopters, and our hazardous area response team. And in addition to that, we've got responders who are volunteer in the community, over 3,000 of them. Across our trust, we've got 96 ambulance stations, varying in various sizes and capabilities at each location, including frontline operations, workshops, training, stores, and everything else in between. Our clinical control rooms is our critical activity for the Trust, and that is where 999 calls are received into the service, and our urgent care service deliver our NHS 111 capability. So that is the gateway into the ambulance service and essentially into the NHS across the Southwest. We've got one in Exeter, one in Bristol, and one in St Leonard's, which is down near Bournemouth. On top of the 4,000 clinical and operational staff that was quoted, we've also got our support staff in our HR, finance, procurement departments, for example. There's a couple of examples that I wanted to talk about today in which we've used Everbridge to massive benefit. The first one of which was an incident in September, which occurred on the M5 in the South Western Ambulance Service area. Now we've got UK threat level is severe, which means an attack is highly likely. So our trust at the moment, as well as other all ambulance services, are at a high state of vigilance. And so an incident like this, where there's any mention of firearms, police, we've put the plans in place to be able to react proportionately and appropriately to make sure that we can not only deliver good patient care, but protect the safety of our responders and the wider public. So this incident started off very early in the morning, just outside of our area. I won't go into the details, but the details that we received on the 999 call at about 9:15, 9:20, was that the police had apprehended this vehicle. There was one patient with gunshot wounds to the head. The location of the attacker was unknown. There was no intelligence to suggest that there were further attackers, and there was no intelligence to suggest that they were operating alone, or whether there was anything else other than firearms. So we activated our communication plan, and within the ambulance service we do have the capabilities to responders from the ambulance service into these types of situations. So clearly that comes with a high degree of risk, and the protection of our responders is paramount. So we do have these specialist capabilities available. Now what Everbridge was able to do was not only provide notification of this critical incident to local staff and responders, but we were able to reach out to our specialist trained capability staff through the Everbridge system, and in a matter of moments we were able to alert them of this incident and get a very quick response in terms of the availability of those staff in order to develop a response to this incident. Additionally to this, for these types of incidents, there's an element of command and control required. So we were again able to use Everbridge to reach out to our command teams to make sure that they were fully briefed, to be able to be in a position that they could manage this incident safely and effectively. Thankfully it was just isolated to the one casualty, and police managed to control the incident very quickly. So it was a very good exercise of our systems. We were able to demonstrate that we could, if this was bigger or in another place, call on those responders if we needed to. And it was a good exercise for them as well to know that they were on the system and would be called if required. Another example that I was quite eager to talk to you about was the cyber attack, and we learned a lot of lessons around this. And this for me developed what we'll talk about later in terms of our end-to-end communication plan. So back in May, the WannaCry made national and international news. It was quite a significant cyber attack, and it affected quite a lot of NHS organisations. For us in SWAS, thankfully, it didn't directly affect us. As far as I'm aware, there was one UK ambulance service that was affected, and within our area we had two emergency department hospitals that had actually been directly affected. The actions taken by SWAS on the time, primarily through Everbridge, kind of similar to the M5 job. As soon as we were made aware that there was an issue, we were able to use Everbridge to warm up our command teams so they could get a grip, put in some decision making to protect the trust. And one of those decisions was to shut down our incoming and outgoing email system. And that was deemed because they felt that the way into the trust would be through the email system. So that activated business continuity planning, and we were very quickly able to map the stakeholders and the processes that would therefore be affected by the shutdown of email. Now what we did learn was very quickly was email was actually our kind of comfort zone, our primary source of communication, and suddenly that was cut off. So what we used Everbridge for is not only to escalate and notify our internal mechanisms, but we were very quickly having to use it in innovative ways to contact our external stakeholders to alert them that the normal processes and means into the trust were no longer available. But when we were dealing with patient critical information, Everbridge maintained our communication to the outside world through voice delivery, emails, and text messaging, depending on the criticality of the notification. So whilst we created ourselves a little island that we sat on quite happily, Everbridge was our bridge then to make sure that we could still maintain a safe service, engage with our stakeholders, and keep them updated pretty regularly on the current situation.
Thank you, Ollie. So Neil Laver here. We're just going to spend the rest of the session really overviewing what we define as the 8 best practices for for managing a crisis. I will, at a few points, defer back to Ollie, who can add some colour based on his experience at Southwest Ambulance. So we can just move on to the next slide. So really, organisations are, impacted a lot of the time by all sorts of different kinds of events. In 2016, it's hard to calculate this, but the estimated loss of emergencies, crises, gaps in business continuity is estimated at around $535 billion. So a huge amount of lost revenue, lost investment, impacts organisations of all types, whether they're traditional profit-making organisations or in the public sector as well. And obviously the net effect of all of that can also mean impact to people's real lives. So important that we as a community, as an industry, try and do what we can to address this and reduce it. So let's move into our best practice number one, which is about having a plan. So before you go ahead and even communicate, it's important to have a plan. So a lot of basic stuff here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with key ways of building plans. So understanding the different types of plans, defining whether plans are about routine emergencies or for real crises, determining different causes, and is this a local crisis or which is something like Ollie described the issue there on the M5, or a widespread crisis. In the case of the WannaCry virus, obviously that was a global crisis that impacted organisations regardless of where they are, and then really defining those plans, based on a matrix organisation. So that's pretty standard stuff. Really evolving that more into understanding that to build and manage those plans, the organisations that we work with, on average, can have 6 or so different systems to manage the creation of those plans, and storage of the plans, and then handling those plans when they need to be used in an event. And this obviously builds in a certain amount of inefficiency in our ability to do that. So we've thought about adapting the best practice here. It's not just about having a plan, it's about having a unified plan. So preparing for that and being enabled to work your way through this life cycle of planning. So being able to triage the issue and respond to it, and then get systems back up and running, and importantly, being able to determine, through a post-mortem, a post-event exercise of analysis, determining how things can be improved, identifying parts of your organisation that did really well, and parts of the organisation that perhaps need to improve how they are coping with a particular issue or emergency. And you can see there, again, by no means exhaustive list, but a pretty comprehensive list of all the different stakeholders that need to be part of developing and optimizing those plans over time. So having that unified plan, number one, we've dealt with that one. Want you all, by the way, to prepare, because at the end we're going to try and do a little bit of interaction with you as an audience to see how many of these plans all of you are either already have implemented or are using in some way today. So on to our second best practice. This is about communicating through all the stages. Most organizations are pretty good at responding at that initial triaging, and then the next step is really responding to people. But again, best practice from both the BCI and customers that we talk to, it's important to communicate through all the stages. Activate it through the detecting a situation, analyzing it, ensuring there's clear communication, so your stakeholders, your end users you can help them differentiate between what is a routine and what is a crisis. What is a life and death situation versus something that isn't. And so, Ollie, I think we're getting through this kind of standard life cycle of a communication of an incident. Ollie, I believe we're going to go on to you. You're going to talk through a little bit more detail about what this means in a real life organisation like Southwest Ambulance.
Well, so we've had quite an interesting week since last Sunday. So about 1600, so 4 o'clock last Sunday, the 8th, we had a critical major electrical failure in our Exeter headquarters, which affected our critical systems which deliver our control rooms. So that's the 999 call system, our CAD, command and control system that they use to process the calls and dispatch the ambulances, our airwave network, which is our radio system to be able to talk from control to our operational crews. And so essentially we were in darkness. Now clearly there's a lot of investigation and root cause analysis going on, but it's been quite an interesting week. And this, I mentioned earlier on about the lessons that we picked up through cyber attack and the M5 job, and this event last week absolutely validated the specific communication plan that we put into place through the different modules that are available on Everbridge. And it worked to brilliant effect. So this incident demonstrated to us that end-to-end life cycle of a communication notification process and an incident, from incident detection right the way through to recovery and stand down.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that little bit of colour there. So moving on to our third best practice, this is about planning to communicate with all stakeholders. Again, you know, we tend to think generally about let's get in contact with our employees, but the organisations that can handle crises best by using a lot of different forms of technology are those who differentiate between their various stakeholders. So this is an example here of a cyber attack. It's detected very early on. You know, have a differentiated system in place to make IT security aware that there's an issue. Then bringing together the critical incident team. Really important to notify the executive team very early, and a lot of organisations have kind of on-call, off-call arrangements with their executive team. They tend to be very demanding when it comes to knowing what is going on. So you may have to think about having, you know, dedicated situation reports being sent to your exec team the whole time. And then you can see as this issue progresses, it's not just about resolving it, but it's about ensuring that a lot of other organisations or other groups, within an organisation are aware of what's going on. So that could be legal, customer service, ensuring our marketing people are getting the messaging out to our external stakeholders in the right way, informing customers who may be dependent on you, and then, you know, in there of course there's employees, but again understanding how all of those different flavours of people need to be communicated at different times through the life cycle of a crisis, but also how the messaging needs to be properly differentiated. So again, just going to hand over to Ollie, who's going to briefly talk about their experience with stakeholder organisation this month. Go ahead, Ollie.
The old mute button trick. Sorry. So yeah, the end-to-end communication plan absolutely came out last week for this incident. So very much started at detection, and we need to very quickly get those messages out to let stakeholders know that we're unable to take 999 calls or process them. So that's the internal command team to allow them to support the response, and our external stakeholders, which included neighbouring ambulance services, a national coordination centre, so they could start coordinating support and mutual aid. The internal facing bit was around our staff management, so this was affecting our trust headquarters in Exeter and our critical activities in the trust. Now in SWAST, our business continuity strategy is about protecting the SWAST 5, one of which is our control room. So that managing expectations via staff was where other departments were able to come. They were made aware of not only their own base being affected, but that support and assistance was required in our control rooms to manage the overall response. So managing those expectations in terms of alternative fallback locations, relocating staff, where staff were displaced, keeping in contact with them to make them know about hotel bookings and transport, etc. The thing for us was how we communicated and managed that national impact. So because we lost our call volume, and we're taking on average about 2,000 calls a day, for that initial incident response, the 999 calls were distributed across the UK. So we had to have means, and we developed the initial notification through Everbridge, and then the means to be able to communicate and have that two-way communication with our partners across the whole of the UK, which is the first time this has happened for us. The last event of this kind of magnitude where it did affect the UK, if you remember back to New Year's Eve, where London Ambulance Service had a similar issue. Our plan was in place, and it was able to be sustained by mapping out regular updates through different means through the system from Sunday right the way through to Friday. And that was capturing those and maintaining those initial notifications internally and externally. And it went right the way through, really kind of escalated the amount of communication when we entered our recovery phase, when remedial works were being completed to keep staff updated. And as it happened on the Friday, we were expecting the work to be done by 11 o'clock, but there were further issues. But the planning and the system was flexible enough that we could re-escalate. And then the stand down planning was all there. And for us, it is about undoing all of those notifications that we'd initially made. So going back over and making sure that those that we put on standby and alerted were then stood down as well. And it was four-dimensional. So it was about the internal and external and making sure that the messages were relevant and accurate. We were quoted on some of the messages that went out in local media, through our comms department, through social media. And it was about managing the response, managing the recovery, and then the stand down again. Just to throw in there, before we could take a breath, so we stood down on the Friday, back in on the Sunday, activating the same planning, the same stakeholders through the same methods again, to manage the response to the severe snow, particularly in our North Division around Gloucestershire, Forest of Dean and the Cotswolds. And again, staff notification to manage their expectations, and our external stakeholders as well, just to make sure that we could keep the business ticking over.
Excellent, thank you, Ollie. Obviously been kept very busy lately. So moving on to our fourth best practice, and that's planning for unreliable communications. So there are lots of different what we call modalities or means to communicate to your stakeholders. Some examples there of SMS, telephone, mobile phone app, email, etc. But the key thing to remember is that no one of those single delivery paths is ever 100% reliable. If you ever find yourself in a position of choosing the one best path, that is something you shouldn't do, because there's no path that is always reliable and is available 100% of the time. So you should plan on some modes, multimodal. I mean, the more modes you use, the more effective your communication will be. So an example of this was the terrorism in Belgium last year. In this particular case, via Twitter, the advice that the Belgian local authorities were giving to people in the area was to call via landline to a number there. But it became pretty quickly obvious that the telephone network was being saturated. So they had to follow up, say, please don't use the telephone, use texting or social media. And those gradually became overwhelmed as well. And we see here, my French is very good, but we're seeing please don't use the internet, limit your usage, because that's also getting saturated. So important in those situations to have those multimodal systems that use the traditional voice network to landlines, mobile cellular networks, data networks, and other modes of ensuring that communication can get through in as many possible ways to keep your stakeholders informed. Following that, is another example here in terms of the Bastille Day truck attacks down in Nice. There was a lot of investment by the French authorities, I believe it was in France, to bring out a dedicated smartphone app. But again, because that was single mode based just through the app, at times when the data network was compromised, the alerts to that app over the data network didn't get through. So a lot of people were not, friends and family, potential victims didn't really, even though they'd installed the app, they weren't kept up to date with what was going on. But had they, again, the government really built something that utilised multi-modes, maybe phone networks, the SMS network, etc., there'd have been more better communication. Again, they took a lot of heat on that through the internet. So again, another example here in the US where we see cell phones going dead. Again, the Boston bombing, same kind of thing. Cell phones went dead, but the SMS and data networks are still working, so those messages could have got through. So we have loads of incidents around the world. There's another one here in the UK where the 3 network was compromised up in the northwest of England. And again, these are things that we need to plan for. The only thing we can plan for is by using as many modes as we can. So it's really the only way to increase delivery, ensure that we get the right notification out there and the maximum possible response from our stakeholders. So again, I'm going to just ask Ollie to talk about his experience at South West Ambulance and how they use multimodal to really ensure the widest possible response and delivery.
Thanks, Neil. So one of our responsibilities at the point of a major incident, so in the event that there's a situation where we've got lots and lots of casualties, I mentioned earlier we're the gateway to the NHS, and as part of our responsibilities is to communicate and cascade out to our stakeholders to let them know, especially around emergency departments and hospitals, so that they can start clearing out the A&E, bringing in consultants, cancelling electives, etc., etc. So we use the system to go out to those external stakeholders, and what Everbridge is able to offer is a text-to-speech. So that is the primary means, and if we instigate a cascade, that will go directly into the emergency departments and deliver a briefing of what the incident is. But linked to that, what we've encouraged hospitals and other stakeholders, such as St. John, Red Cross, Police and Fire, is to give us text message delivery options, email delivery options. So we've built that on as well, and what we found is compared to the previous system, is that when we're sending out cascade messages, we're able to increase our response rate from 2% right the way up to 100%. The last exercise that we completed, and we complete this element on a weekly basis with our hospitals and quarterly with all of our other stakeholders, we've improved that to 100%, and that is quite a consistent response, and that can range from quite simply pressing 1 to acknowledge a briefing, or something more substantial to let us know that they've received it. And that's really key, because we need to have that ability to be able to know that they are expecting us to turn up with lots and lots of patients potentially. Because it comes with that risk of lots and lots of patients, as well as trying to balance our business as usual demand, because whilst these major incidents are going on, public will still be having heart attacks and breathing problems, so we still do need to balance our business as usual with the major incident response. So it operates on that kind of recall to duty basis. So we will go out to our operational staff, our support functions, our command structure, and again, what that's done is that whole process of having to previously pick up the phone and map out and try and capture staff availability has dramatically reduced from an hour plus to under 4 minutes, simply by putting in options where they can highlight their availability, and having that in a central place so it keeps it nice and clean and tidy. We can very quickly see what our trust response may be. And again, that is delivered over various means, so email, app notification, likewise where they can send us a location as well, and text delivery. It's a two-way process, freeing up resource time to be able to focus on actually delivering a response to the incident.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Some really good insight there into the benefits of multimodal. Thinking more broadly on more of a global scale now, here's a kind of indication of a fairly typical multinational organization who may have customer service teams and sales offices and network and security operations centers spread around the world. And it's important to anticipate that. The kind of infrastructure that we enjoy here in the UK and Europe for delivery of messages isn't always, you shouldn't assume that the same standards exist elsewhere in the world. Everbridge, we have tried really hard and continue to develop relationships with carriers around the world and local governments to ensure that the highest possible quality of message delivery that we can. And there's some examples on this slide of organizations we work with to ensure that notification messages that you would need to send in a crisis are prioritized against other forms of communication. So again, work with a partner with a supplier like ourselves who can really offer this kind of very high standard global delivery of pretty important messages, because you don't always know where your staff are. We have a lot of data that shows increasingly people are more and more mobile. 70% of business people are expected to be mobile or semi-mobile by, I think it's 2018. So we have to account for that. We have to ensure that we have the means to communicate to them wherever they are in the world. Equally, when we think about planning for your organization, it's important to both think about the environment, the internal environment to your organization. So, health secure is my office, but also, my employees don't generally spend 100% of their time in the office. They commute to and from the office. Maybe they pop out to lunchtime to grab a sandwich or use the ATM. So at those points in time, what potential threats are they exposed to? How can I, at the point where an incident happens, ensure that I have a pretty good idea of where all of my employees and stakeholders are? So again, there's geo mapping capabilities here to define a geofence and determine who is in that, or on an ongoing crisis, who may enter that geofence zone. And again, you'll want to be in a position to send those stakeholders an appropriate message determined by the type and severity of the incident. We always talk as well about having a multi-layered approach. Most organizations have a pretty good idea of where people should be. But as I mentioned a minute ago, when I said people are increasingly mobile, increasingly means they're not where they should be. So it's important to have a means to determine through other technology where they are. So mobile aware, if people have got an app that reports their current location, that is helpful to determine whether someone is near or in a crisis zone. We have technology that enables us to integrate with building access systems like Linnell and Tyco, etc. So at a point where you may have an issue in a building, you can communicate with someone who's in there because they're badged into the building, even though they're not actually assigned to that office on an ongoing basis. Travel awareness. So again, I met this morning with an international accountancy company who have a huge, at any one point in time, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people who are traveling internationally for their organization. So it's important that they know not only if there was an incident in London that they can communicate with their London employees, but also they can make anyone who may be visiting from overseas aware that there was an ongoing incident in that particular location. And then finally, we can take a view of someone's current or expected location from scheduling. Maybe they have booked to stay in a hotel, so we can integrate with hoteling systems like Dean Evans, or they've booked a meeting room in an office as well. That's a primary indicator that their expected location may be in a specific location in a city and a country. So again, aggregating all of that multiple information to give you the best and most accurate idea about where people are based on their expected, actual, and static location. So we're down to our final one now, really, and this is the one that's very important. It's about getting the humans out of the process. And we do know from a lot of incidents that have happened in the UK, we tend to see our customers clustered into two groups: those who are able to respond really, really quickly to a particular instance, like Westminster Bridge, and those who take quite a bit longer. And certainly our anecdotal evidence seems to be that those who use workflow technology like our incident communications module are able to respond much quicker, because it enables them to take a lot of the decision making out of the process. If I have to write a custom communication piece every time I face an incident, it's very hard to do. It's easy to do when business is as usual or during a test event, but when I'm really facing an unexpected event, that pressure on the individual makes it very hard. So it's important to pre-write a lot of these communication templates that we do, but also make it easier for the person sending the alert by pre-programming the location, the building, and the response that you want from people. It leads to much quicker ability to be able to communicate, and really crisis teams can then focus on the important stuff, like collaborating and ensuring that we're beginning to resolve the issue if we're in a position to do so. So those are our 8 best practices. Again, just some examples there about how the incident and quite importantly, the incident templates can be stored on a mobile device. So again, we found a good example was London Bridge because of the time of day that happened. Most people were not in the office, but crisis responders who have an incident response tool, a communication tool in their pocket, were able to very quickly respond and send important information out to stakeholders. So these are the 8 best practices. So before you communicate, have a unified plan, communicating through all the stages through a particular crisis, thinking about all your stakeholders, planning for unreliable communications, having that multimodal approach to the world. If you're an organisation that is global, and many of our customers are, then plan for how we would use communication in more exotic locations. Think about the differences between inside your wall and outside your wall, because people don't stay inside your walls all the time. Having that multi-layered approach to communication, and finally, wherever you can automate your communications, you will improve your impact and the speed of response. So over to you, Natasha. I think you're going to ask people.
Yeah, so we're now going to move to a quick poll just to gauge how many of these best practices that we've covered that you're all using. So you'll see the poll on your screen. And then if you just start voting which one applies to you.
And while we're doing that, we were going to encourage anyone who may have any questions to use the question tool on there to ask questions, and we'll try and work out whether that's. Well, we say whether you want to direct that to myself or to Ollie. Otherwise, we'll maybe answer it together.
That's interesting. Now we're sharing the results of the poll. That's interesting. So 91% of you use 4 or less of the best practices. 5% use none of them. So that's quite interesting.
Is that 5% all of them as well? That's yeah, also quite impressive.
That's quite
interesting. Okay, interesting insight there. In terms of questions, Natasha, while we're doing that, so if you think you've got another minute or two to think about questions, I'm just going to take 1 or 2 minutes just to talk about Everbridge, because some of you may not be familiar with it. So we are, we're essentially an enterprise software application, and principally what we try and do is keep people safe. I've touched on that, and also businesses running. So in the event that critical systems are, we find ourselves in a position where critical systems go down, it's important to be able to alert people so that we can have a quick response and get them back up and running again. Critical event management can, they can take on all sorts of different types of events covered on the left there. We think we're pretty credible. We have a lot of very big customers, and I won't go through all of these individually, but you can see that in terms of banks and airports and health insurance and car makers, that we are very much the global leading organisation in this particular area. Okay.
So at this point, we're going to move on to our question and answer session. So we have a few questions that have come in that we're going to cover now. As a reminder to all, you can continue to submit any questions that you have in the box, and if you just send your question to all panelists. Okay, so our first question. Okay, the first question is, I cover multiple and varied sites, but with one common denominator, crowded places. Are more operations now having one set structure to respond, or is it the case that each location is being addressed separately? So is there one process for each location, or is it just one for the whole group? How would you advise?
Well, we in some ways go back to the inside and outside your location there. I mean, it's possible to do both locations. I guess when it's crowd, I'm assuming the comment about crowded spaces, it would mean crowded spaces with the public, and so this potentially sounds like an organisation, maybe they're running multiple shopping centres or something like that. So we can, in terms of advice, you probably want a multi-layered system where you had both the ability to communicate to that individual premises. Maybe it would be security or facilities management there. But there may also be organization-wide communication. So in the event that they have some kind of IT system where multiple sites were dependent upon that, you also had the ability to communicate to multiple. So, from a planning point of view and preparation point of view, I think it's probably key to plan for both and structure, things in that way. And this is something that I think Ollie Ollie, you're responsible for multiple sites, so maybe you also have some insight on this question.
Yeah, I think one of the absolute key things for us is about making the notifications and the messages relevant to the audience that are receiving it. So it's no good blanket texting out overtime shifts across the whole trust if they're hundreds of miles away. And we find that we get better engagement from the recipients if the message is relevant and accurate. So I think if you do need to add different layers in based on what you want to tell and who, that should form your communication plan. So it might be that you have specific notifications just for one site, but actually the umbrella notification that goes out to capture multiple sites is more relevant to that staff. So one of the things that when I'm delivering training around the system, when we're building out communication planning, is absolutely that key point about making sure that the message and the audience is relevant and accurate.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ollie. Another question here. Is the tool integrated with ServiceNow?
Well, that's a pretty simple answer to that one is yes. So we do. So for those of you who don't know, that's an IT service management tool. ServiceNow pretty much the market leader, but there are other tools, and so we integrate, and we have a good partnership with ServiceNow and also most of the other leading ITSM tools. So simple answer to that one.
Thank you. Okay, another one. Which communication method has been the most effective?
Okay, I'll let Ollie kick off on that one. So for you, Ollie, which communication method has been the most effective?
SMS, definitely. Because staff have got their phones in their hands all the time, so I guess you could also argue that notification as a close second. And I think so SMS, because they've got it, it's quick, it's less intrusive. But then on the flip side, stakeholders that we've spoken to really do appreciate the phone ringing and the text-to-speech method, just because it introduces that layer of criticality and urgency.
Yeah, I would say probably I don't know of a single company that doesn't use SMS. It's kind of usually the first choice they make. Increasingly, we're seeing via the app as a very popular choice. We work with a lot of customers who've got quite young staff, and so as younger millennials, I guess you want to call them, enter the workplace, they have a preference for that. And one of the benefits of the app is that you can send more complex information, so graphics, for instance, or pictures of a muster point, or so that richer message format, I think, has some benefits. But I think SMS is going to be around for quite a while. It's definitely the #1 choice.
Okay. Another question is, exercising crisis can sometimes be difficult to get stakeholder buy-in. Comms is one area that people often take for granted. Do you have any suggestions of how we test comms failure without the exercise developing out of control or timescale?
Well, that's definitely one for Ollie. I mean, sorry to drop you in there, Ollie. You and I think we discussed that last time we met. So please, I'd be interested in you repeating your insight.
Yeah, very much. And I've got plenty of examples recently where a lot of our key communications have been unavailable. From a personal point of view, the benefits and the best way that I get out of exercising it is the no notice element. So if we are doing any exercising, we clearly avoid expected high demand times, but actually communicating with staff with little or no notice sometimes allows them to react in a more natural way. But sometimes I take your point that there is risk about taking down one particular process, but sometimes for us it is a case of balancing that risk to not doing it and then finding ourselves in a difficult position. So sometimes it is a case of just biting the bullet. But a mantra of ours is to do the usual in the unusual way. So if it is a case that you're using notification systems or email, then carry on doing that, but just with a different kind of scenario basis behind it, and see how staff react.
Thanks, Ollie. Okay, we'll take a few more questions, and then any that we can't get to today, we can take them offline. So this one is about WhatsApp. So is Everbridge compatible with WhatsApp?
Yeah, there are two about WhatsApp there. So, you know, how is it received? Is it compatible? The simple answer is it isn't. You know, we don't interface with WhatsApp. It's not. It's essentially it's a consumer tool. I know it's used a lot in businesses. It's a question we get quite a lot. There are some you know, user T's and C's that actually prevent you from using it in business, but hey, you know, we still do. And there are some security concerns as well. I mean, WhatsApp has signaled a couple of years ago that they were considering creating an enterprise edition, but nothing has been forthcoming. But right now, there's no easy way to integrate with that. Yeah, so that's where we are on WhatsApp.
Okay, so the final question. So this is one for Ollie, I think. How did you convince your teams to install the app? Like, how did you get your stakeholders to adopt and start using the system?
So for SWAST, we use an opt-out process, in that when they join the trust or if they change role, HR sends me details, we load them onto the system, and then we contact them through the system to say this is Everbridge, it'll be used for overtime texts and high-level trust news and major incidents. However, if you want to come off it, then reply with stop, and that's fine. So it's an opt-out process, but through that process, we do send them a link to be able to download the app, and also create their own profile so they can manage their own communications. For stakeholders, it was part of the agreement that if they wanted to come onto our cascade to be alerted for major incident, then this was one of the requirements. Sorry, I had another point I was going to make, which has completely gone out of my head. But that opt-in, opt-out process really is key.
Okay, I mean, the only other thing I see a lot, we've got some, if any of you are Everbridge customers, we've got some content that we can share with you, that, you know, pre-written email templates, etc., to use. Plus also, we see a lot of customers add the app to the enterprise app store. That's quite common in big businesses, and then promote it that way. But thanks, Ollie, for that insight into how you've done it.
Okay, so we're now at the end of our allotted time. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to both Neil and Ollie for the presentation today. If you have any additional questions, please get in touch at hello@everbridge.com. We're happy to help. Thank you all, and have a good day.